Well, happening now, Donald Trump has entered a plea of not guilty related to his alleged attempts to overturn the 2020 election in Georgia. In a court filing that was released this morning, the former president entered his plea and waived his right to appear at his arraignment. Congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane has been following this story for us. He joins us now from a very blue-skied Capitol Hill. Hey there, Scott. So it's not a surprise that Trump pled not guilty. How does his formally entering this plea impact the case?
It closes the opening chapter of what could be a legal novel, Lana. This is the blocking and tackling of criminal cases. You have an arraignment, you have a process by which you can plead guilty or not guilty, and Donald Trump opted to invoke his right to do so remotely through a court motion, which spares him from the photo op of walking into a courthouse next Wednesday to do so, and a courthouse which, by the way, allows cameras inside the courtroom. Donald Trump has made that plea official and now proceeds to the rest of the case. The question that serves as a foundation to the next few weeks and months in this case is how fast does it move? We know at least one of his co-defendants is seeking to have a speedy trial, a trial as early as October. Donald Trump most certainly will not want to have the same. Because this is such a sweeping, broad, unprecedented racketeering case, 18 co-defendants, total of dozens of charges, it's unclear how fast the prosecutor really can move, no matter how fast she wants to move. So with the arraignment over, this case could, for Donald Trump, go quiet for a while.
Hey, Scott, I want to follow up, though, on what you said, that his waiving the right to appear spares him that photo op when we know that his campaign, at least, has been monetizing the other photo ops, the arraignment photo. Why would he want to be spared this particular photo?
There's such a subtle difference, Lana. In the previous court appearances or jail appearances this month, Donald Trump was able to control the optics. At the jail in Fulton County, he entered through an entrance which could not be photographed, and no cameras were allowed inside the jail. All we saw that day, in addition to a mugshot he posed for, was his jet arriving at an airport with his name proudly emblazoned on the aircraft, and what appeared to be something of a presidential motorcade going from the airport to the jail. Here in Washington, D.C., when he was arraigned at the start of the month, he arrived through a secret entrance that where photographs are prohibited, and inside the courthouse, cameras are banned there too. He controlled the optics, gave a news conference at an airport hangar where he controlled the background. In court next week, if he were to show up in person in Fulton County, he'd lose control of some of the optics. He'd be walking into a courthouse potentially. There's cameras allowed inside. He doesn't have the ability to massage how the imagery looks. And as a candidate for high office and somebody who's trying to use some of these court appearances to goose fundraising and goose support, he may feel like he's losing some of the control.
Interesting. All right. Scott, I also want to ask you about Republicans in Georgia trying to remove and defund the district attorney, Fani Willis, who's running that case. The Republican governor, Brian Kemp, really slammed his fellow Republicans who are pushing for that. He did so publicly today. Talk to us about what he said.
Yeah, the Republican governor just threw a whole bucket of cold water on these ideas Republicans in his state, his fellow Republicans in the state legislature, are cooking about trying to either defund or dethrone Fani Willis from her position or from this investigation and prosecution. We've seen this in other places. Here in Washington, D.C., there are Republicans in Congress trying to defund the special counsel, Jack Smith. Those efforts aren't going to go anywhere, and Brian Kemp, the Republican governor, who has been so often opposed to Donald Trump since November 2020, as Trump baselessly claimed election fraud in his state, Kemp is snuffing out this effort by some of his Republican state legislators to try to defund Fani Willis. He actually referred today to the potential that all of that is unconstitutional and most certainly, he says, unjustified.
All right, Scott, thank you. For more on this breaking news, CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson also joins us. Jessica, what are the implications of a defendant in this case, the former president, not appearing in court?
I think exactly what Scott MacFarlane just said, which is he's controlling the visual narrative here. The implications legally are really nothing. He has the opportunity to walk into court and say not guilty. He has the opportunity to say in writing, as he did today, not guilty. So I don't think it telegraphs anything about the specifics of his legal defense. I think exactly as Scott said, it telegraphs his desire to tightly control the images that we see, particularly concerning these cases.
So it sounds like this is really a run-of-the-mill filing.
Well, I mean, so I will say nothing about these cases is of the mill in the sense that, of course, we're talking about criminal charges against the former president. But I think you're absolutely right that a defendant's decision to say for something like an arraignment, I will not appear, instead, I will just submit my plea via writing. Nothing about that is earth-shattering. I don't think we should take that to mean anything, again, about the specifics of the prosecutor's case or the defense's case here.
Jessica, have you been able to discern anything about Trump's legal strategy moving forward?
Well, I think what he's going to do in the first instance is follow suit, following his former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and try and remove this case to federal court. And the biggest advantage to him for being in federal court is trying to get a better jury. I'll remind everybody of what everybody already knows, which is when it comes to a criminal case, the prosecutor has to convince all 12 jurors, it has to be unanimous, that they have shown their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And so a jury pool really does matter. And part of that desire to move to federal court is looking at, frankly, political registration numbers in the federal district that the case would be tried in. I think it would also kind of reduce the home court advantage for the district attorney, because the district attorney is used to trying their cases in state court. If they're in federal court, I think the former president would throw them off their game a little bit. But the former president would have to say, I acted within the course and scope of my official duties. Now, what else do we expect to see, regardless of whether this case is in federal court or state court? I think the president saying, particularly with respect to those racketeering or RICO charges that you and I have been talking about ever since this indictment came out, I think the president's going to say, not it. Other people tried to do those things. You can't implicate me in their behavior. And then I also think he'll say, to the extent I did anything that was unwise, my attorneys told me to do that.
All right, Jessica Levinson, thank you.
Thank you.